Hello, students. This is my last lecture. I imagine you're saying, "Yay, this is your last lecture." This is my last lecture for our course on American literature. It's going to be much shorter than my one on Arthur Miller and the history of Marxist discourse in America and its context. This isn't about Marxism. This is about the works of Jimmy Santiago Baca. I've uploaded a video of him reciting some of his poetry, and you have the three works that you were asked to read. I think his work is very evocative and speaks generally for itself, but I did want to tell you a bit about what he does. Um, I've called this lecture The Works of Jimmy Santiago Baca, Poems about the Latinx Heroes of Uncomfortable Places. Um, Jimmy Santiago Baca didn't get a master's degree in writing. That's the standard issue way that most people today become poets. He started writing in prison instead. He says in one of his interviews, uh, I grew up on the streets of LA, and it turns out that I'm a very bad thief, and he was caught and sent to prison. And in the prison library, he says he discovered he was a much better writer than he was a thief. Um, he read books in the prison library and started telling the truth of his life there, and indeed, what led him there, and indeed the things that were a source of anger for him that inspired him to do things that were destructive both to himself, because he ended up in prison for them, and destructive to the community at large. And in doing so, he opened a window to those of us who don't belong to the community of East LA, into the dignity of people that normally in our society don't get a whole lot of respect globally. I'm not talking about people who steal cars, which is what he was attempting to do when he was arrested, but about Latino and Latina people, um, who are often treated as second-class citizens, even when they're citizens, and often as the lowest of the low human existence in this country, despite the fact that, of course, all Latinx people are as human as you are or I are. Um, he got out of prison and pretty quickly published a book of his poetry and started writing about the lives of the streets of East LA. And he writes in the vernacular. And vernacular, remember, is the way that people really talk. Um, uh, he includes in that vernacular not just the English that you hear in my lectures, not Spanish like one hears in Barcelona, which is a very high intellectual Spanish, but Spanglish, which is mostly English with Spanish thrown in, which is indeed the language of the streets there. Perhaps you already know this, but it's kind of like that with Cajun, if you have any relatives who speak Cajun French. Very few of them speak nothing but Cajun. It's usually a combination of French and English, which French speakers call franglais, which is the way that people really speak. And just so you know, there are some poets who are writing with Cajun influence. Darrell Bourke is one of them in the state of Louisiana, where there are overtones of the French Cajun cultural experience. Our own poet laureate right now, Jacques Bedell, writes poems that make a nod to his Cajun experiences. Right now, he's less interested in discussing that than he is um, uh, problems with storms and floods. Um, the poems of Jimmy Santiago Baca are heroic narratives about Latinx people in this country. Um, the people who barely get a nod of acknowledgement from uh, the people of the middle class or upper middle class, he treats them in his work often like mythic people from ancient epic poetry, grandmothers who cook meals that have a sort of a magic power to them. Um, Ordinary people, like in the poem Tire Shop, who have menial jobs, who are worthy of great dignity, um, and have a deep kind of wisdom that they impart. In his memoir, A Place to Stand, he writes, I culled poetry from odors, sounds, faces, and ordinary events occurring around me. Breezes bulged me as if I were cloth. Sounds nicked their marks on my nerves. Objects made impressions on my sight as if in clay. There, in the soft language, life centered and ground itself in me, and I was flowing with the grain of the universe. Language placed my life experiences in a new context, freeing me for the moment to become with air as air, with clouds as clouds, from which new associations arose to engage me in present life in a more purposeful way. Allow me to say that this matters, particularly that language has the power to give context and share context with a larger group of people when one writes the subjective truth in a manner that opens a window to empathy, which indeed his work. His work honors people who rarely receive honor. Most of his characters have a deep resilience to them as they struggle to be fully recognized as part of this country. And his poems often read like anthems to their full humanity. Um, I hope you really enjoy his poetry. I think it's the most accessible work that I've given you this semester, and it's one of my favorite things on the syllabus for you. What I would have you notice as a closing thought is that as America acknowledges its complex diversity, more and more kinds of voices become part of what former mayor of New York, Mayor Dinkins, calls the glorious mosaic of America and indeed of American literature. I hope you've enjoyed the readings of this course. I think that they tell us a story about this country's history that mere facts, dates, and names of battles could never do. Thank you.